Episode 269, Start Right. This is the Change Underground. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. A bit of a longer episode this week, but I hope it'll be worth the listen. So you're ready to start your journey into the world of regenerative smallholding. Well done, but what next? Well, I found an article on the site Grow Journey. 15 tips to start a small farm using regenerative practices. There's a link in the show notes, obviously, for this. And 15 seems a fun number, so let's dive in. See what Chris Miller of Horseshoe Farm in South Carolina has to say, and tease out some ideas of our own. So, tip 1. Get farming experience on multiple farms before you start a farm. Now, this is a great idea, if you can wangle it. There's nothing like going to a font or indeed several fonts of knowledge. You'll develop your own practices anyway, but having a starting point on reality is a good point to begin with. As it turns out, my real farmer mentor was John Seymour. For poultry on my first place, to be fair, you'd have to have a lot of serious issues if poultry were a challenge. Our second place was larger, and I enrolled in a small area farming course at the local technical and further education college. It turned out the teacher and I connected and just clicked, so that not only was I learning in class and practice, I got to watch him in action up on his place. Thank you, Andrew. It is always appreciated. He gave me our first flock of sheep, Sussex, and a couple of non-show standard sun and dairy goats, and we were away. For me, the idea has always been to support ourselves and maybe have a small surplus. So the need for money-making, minimal cost, highly efficient practices didn't and hasn't featured highly in what we do. If you've borrowed to buy land or are renting, then the pressures of constantly recurring debt might focus the mind a little more. And this raises the question of why, as in, why are we going into growing? Well worth a decent amount of contemplation before you start. Tip 2. Read and learn from the world's best small farmers. This I concur with entirely. The amount of available material nowadays is a bit mind-boggling. There was plenty when I started dibbling my toes into the waters of food production, but nowhere near as much as there is now. And as I imagine you all know by now, Seymour was my first dance, then Fukuoka, Jevons and the Rodale thing. But there was also 2 magazines here in Australia, Grassroots and Earth Garden. I read them hungrily. They are written by smallholders, living the dream as they say, and full of hands-on practical advice. I even managed to have a few articles of my own published there as I got better at what I was doing. So look around and find the things that help. There's magazines in just about every market where you'll be able to find something. Tip 3. Have 1 year of savings and or a second job when you start your farm. Now this is an idea I wish I'd known about. The list of unexpected costs can be quite staggering. Equally, the rural mindset is to improvise, adapt and overcome. Having the cash in reserve is nice, so too is the ability to creatively solve problems. In our current location, I allowed Mrs. ChangeUnderground to talk me into sheep before her kids came to visit. It was fine, a ewe lambed while the first wave were visiting, and then the younger grandkids managed to see a young lamb. All good. The electric fence was holding the 4 ewes and the ram as well as the lamb. Then as the season dried out and the sheep decided they could roam further to find feed, the electric fence didn't hold, and we weren't fenced on one boundary. And at the time I couldn't afford to fence that side either. So no amount of extra strands and second energizer on a backup fence line made any difference. The solution was to sell the sheep on and fence the boundary over time. The pigs have never had an issue with an electric fence. They're too bright to test it too often. And occasionally they'll bump into it without thinking, and then they remember that it's there. So as a rule of thumb, have as much money in reserve as possible. Tip 4. Don't break ground, cover ground. This one is a no-brainer. No dig is the only way to go for all the reasons we've discussed on this podcast for the last 5.5 years. That being said, sometimes the decision to break ground will be a rational one. Just get something growing as soon as you can. The engine of photosynthesis is what drives the soil biota. The more living plants, the better. So sometimes people want to start their rotation with potatoes, dug in the traditional manner. If that's the case, make sure you've got other stuff growing and or a mulch to put over the top. Cover the ground, don't break it. And if you do break it, cover it anyway. Tip number 5, remember, regenerative farming is a business, not a non-profit. Now this is where the reason for living out of town really matters. If you're farming for business, run a business. If you're homesteading, it's still a business, but the debt levels will probably be much lower, and options like barter make more sense. If you're fortunate enough to afford to be a modern version of the 19th century's gentleman farmer, then money spent is a tax loss, and the incentives are different. That model can be very useful for experimentation, because if you hit a profitable vein, well, you do well. If not, you still learn and you get your tax loss. So again, know why you are on the land and go from there. Tip number 6, cultivate personal resilience. Now this is a good idea generally for life, I'd suggest. But resilience in farming has a particular variation. Drought, floods, fires, diseases, dogs, and then there's the world off the farm as well. The meme doing the rounds has a farmer saying next week things will slow down. And of course next week never comes. It's always this week. This pod is hardly the place for deep psychological analysis. Resilience is a thing we need to develop, I think, as humans. And it starts the moment our kids are born, training them for it. But I'm not the person to lecture anyone on that. Google might help, or perhaps even better, a medical practitioner could refer you to someone for resilience training. Which seems an odd thing to say, but there you go. Tip number 7, grow your buyers before you grow your crops. This is a good one. Understanding who will buy from you and why makes selling easier. Selling before growing ensures cash flow and a certain pressure to perform. The CSA model, the Community Supported Agriculture model, encapsulates this, as do future trading and so on. I would suggest having plants in the ground and photosynthesising as you find your buyers for the sake of the soil. Remember too, on a small holding homestead model, you are your first customer, so grow what you want to eat, if it grows where you live. In the end, it's a punt either way, as the weather always has the last say. Or as Gabe Brown, and I've got links to Gabe, references I've made to Gabe in the past in the show notes. As Gabe puts it in baseball terms, nature always bats last. Tip number 8, the 85-15 rule. This is the idea that 85% of what you grow is the same year in and year out. It works, people buy it, and everyone's a winner. The other 15% of the is new crops and experimentation, different varieties and so on. I think this percentage holds true for market gardening especially. If you've got some slack in the system, e.g. off-farm work, 15% can get bigger. This gives you the liberty to experiment more and perhaps find the next superfood, even though such things don't exist in nature, but do in economics, if you see what I mean. Tip number 9, don't go it alone. Now, this is a tricky one on some levels. The power of networks and peers cannot be overstated, especially when you're starting. Support, knowledge, access to markets, and so on come from these. The counter-argument is the power of the individual. And I think this has been somewhat overblown in the last half century or so. We are never alone unless we are truly the hermit type, in which case you'd not be listening to this. On the other hand, what you grow, what you sell, and where it comes down to is that you'll need to have resilience. So yes, join with others for support and keep your feet on the soil. Number 10, tip 10. Do you buy land or lease land, or do you be creative? Now, there is a certain security in land ownership. From the ancient Greeks onward, access to land ownership and declining numbers of producers has been a theme in progress, in inverted commas, and rebellion. The reforms of Solon, the land grants to Pompey's troops after the conquest of the eastern Mediterranean, the absent landlords of the Latifundia following the Roman victories in the Punic Wars, the absent landlords in colonised Ireland, the Highland clearances in Scotland, and, well, I think I've made my point. Ownership gives a certain stability. And in a stable society, leasing is a legitimate option, as is share farming, when it's not the post-US Civil War model used in the South, but when it's a genuine partnership between landowner and skilled operator, everyone wins. And there are other options too, the be creative option. Older people with large backyards in suburbia are sometimes happy to allow a gardener to grow on the space. Local authorities often have unutilised land you can offer to, in inverted commas, rehabilitate and make productive. You may even be able to charge a fee for this service. The opportunities really are unlimited. So if you want to grow for a living, there will be a way. Tip number 11. Get your basic tools and infrastructure in order. Now, this depends a lot on what you're doing. Sheep and goats and so on, you will need good fences and yards, and milking facilities if you've got dairy animals. Growing veggies for sale, you'll need washing stations, hoes, shovels, rakes and other implements of destruction, with apologies to R.L. Guthrie there. Speak to others in your chosen niche. Observe carefully as you travel about. Clues are everywhere if you are observant. Notice the shape of fruit trees and how they are pruned. Watch them grow through the seasons and observe the results. And remember this one truth: no matter how well you are prepared, once you start on the journey and your feet hit the dirt, you will have missed something. Tip 12. Invest rather than pay ahead. Following on from the last point, make do and adapt until you are certain you'll need the apparently lacking piece of infrastructure. When you do invest in equipment, make sure you buy the best quality you can afford at the time. Cheap tools, when you have a choice, are a false economy. You can guarantee they'll fail when you need them most. Mistakes will be made. I bought what I thought were great mics for mobile podcasting to discover that they didn't match the hype. Eventually I found what I needed, and to be fair, I had to pay for it too. But it works. This holds true for gardening, smallholding, farming tools. Be judicious. Tip 13. Standardise to boost efficiency. Now, this is a key to productivity, so write everything down that you do. That's probably not a bad idea anyway, because then you'll end up with blog posts and whatnot you can use them for. But this way you will see the things that you do repeatedly. The repetitions can be systematised, and you will know when you start doing so. I'll leave it there. It's something that has to be lived to be understood. Tip 14. Diversify through biodiversity. Now, this is broken into two areas: perennial hedgerows and crop rotation. So the hedgerows first. Hedgerows are great. I'm planting some herbal ones: rosemary, sage, thyme and borage, with calendula scattered throughout. And onto those we're going to add dwarf fruit trees so that the hedges are low enough to withstand the roaring 40s breezes we receive in this part of the world. Build yours to fit your locale. The tree-based hedges of Normandy slowed the Allied advance after D-Day because they were so well established. Armoured vehicles, that is tanks, had trouble crossing them. Now, I'm not sure if anti-tank structures are a good starting point, but those hedges were ancient, and I think that was more the point. Crop rotation. This is a thing we're all familiar with, I assume. It does seem to be counter to the Fukuoka grain bed idea, but even those allow for some weed species to bulk out the biodiversity. Otherwise, something like the brassica, legume, roots, potato, tomato family rotation works well. Whatever works where you are. And again, talk to your neighbours. Tip number 15, and this is the painful one. plan to lose so you can plan to win. Now, the subject of the original article plans on a 40% crop loss each season. Now, for those who aren't in the game, this seems excessive at first reading, but trust me, it isn't. He's growing vegetables and things just die, hailstorms arrive, pests, all kinds of things. And it's the same with livestock, if that's your chosen route. Some lambs just don't make it, no matter how hard you try and what you do. Predators will take all your chickens in a night. It happens. Remember the resilience thing. This part of the world is known for its poppy and pyrethrum daisy production. Last year, half the daisy crop failed. That's 50%. All the rain came at the wrong time. And those that hadn't got their daisies off were wasted. They were gone. So that's a 50% loss. So planning for 40% loss is in fact a slightly optimistic but yet realistic place to start. Maybe you only manage to lose 10%. You're in front. This tip is a brutal wake-up call to those who are new to the game. Remember it happens, and remember the resilience thing. Take-home points. Things are going to go wrong. You'll doubt your own ability, you'll question what you're doing and why. Frosty mornings and numb fingers make for a difficult start to milking, but the milking will get done. You will replace the lost chicken flock. The fruit trees will be pruned a little better next year and the apples will come in abundance. If you are called to the smallholding life, you cannot avoid it forever. Life in all its rich variety will fill your life. Deaths, ruined crops, great successes and a sense of being fully alive are the rewards for the decision to live as a food producer. And if you're thinking about or even ready to make that great leap into smallholding, go to the website worldorganicnews.com and click on the free ebook tab at the top of the page, or in the hamburger if you're on a mobile. There you can obtain a free copy of the Change Underground No-Dig Gardening System ebook. If you've got any other questions, thoughts, suggestions, there's the Change Underground podcast group on Facebook. It's a link in the show notes or search on Facebook. And finally, just remember to decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back next week.